Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hey, Pat Flynn. Welcome back to Sunday School. I want to talk about good versus evil, right versus wrong. Morality has been on my mind lately for a number of reasons, and what I would like to do is explore the nature of morality, good versus evil, right versus wrong, and see if it can tell us anything about God. I am preparing a speech for an ethics class right now to argue for the existence of objective moral values. I figured, you know what, maybe I could just practice this on my podcast, and I'll see if I can do it without any notes. The speech I'm giving is, I think, quite thorough, and I'm going to see if I can record it for the class, and if so, I will repost it somewhere online. And, well, let's start with the term objective moral values. What does that mean? Well, it means something really rather quite intuitive, that there is a such thing as truly right and truly wrong in this world. And all of us really tend to believe this in some form or another. So objective means something is valid and binding, independent of any human opinion of it. Objective is, to say that something is objective means that it exists even when you stop thinking about it, even if there was nobody around to think about it. So what would be an example of that? Well, 2 + 2 = 4 would be an objective truth. That would be true whether somebody believed it or not. It would still be true even if all humans went out of existence. It is not dependent upon human minds for its validity. For example, when I'm at the zoo and I'm looking at an elephant, I would say that the elephant is objectively real. It actually exists. Now, I am having a subjective experience of the elephant. All experience is subjective, meaning that it's my experience, it's my personal experience. But the question is, am I having a subjective experience of an actual object? Am I hallucinating the elephant? Or does the elephant actually exist? And I think most sane people would say that the elephant does exist, that the outside world, this is one of the more fun things that will freak students out when they come into a beginning philosophy class, is prove that the outside world exists empirically or scientifically. And of course you can't. You can only argue that it exists philosophically, because to prove that the outside world exists, that there is actually a world outside of your head, requires the use of your senses. So to do empirical investigations on the outside world requires that you assume that the outside world already exists. It cannot validate itself. So you have to have philosophical assumptions and reasons for assuming that the outside world exists. Well, morality is very much like the existence of the outside world. It is something that seems so overwhelmingly true to our experience. For example, when something really terrible happens, we just can't help but feel like, wow. For example, when something really terrible happens, we just can't help but feel like, wow, that was just so wrong and so evil. When some innocent person gets tortured or killed, we just know, right? That was just a wicked thing. And to the extent, or when somebody does something really good, right, or loving, you notice the language I'm using. If somebody pushes an innocent child out of the street so they don't get hit by a car, and that person gets hit by a car instead, we say, wow, that person did a really good thing. So morality is as obvious and as overwhelming to our experience as the elephant at the zoo. And what we should realize, and this is part of the argument I'll be making in the class, is that this falls into the department of a properly basic belief. And what does that mean in philosophy? Well, it is any any belief that is so, again, obvious and overwhelming to our experience that we are perfectly justified and warranted in holding to that belief unless and until there is some overriding defeater of it. So the elephant, for example, it is so obviously true that I am perfectly warranted and justified in believing that that elephant actually exists, unless somebody can really give me a very good reason why I should think I'm hooked up to the Matrix or something, which I'll give you a hint. There are no really good reasons why you should believe that. Now, morality falls into the same category. It falls into a properly basic belief. And pretty much any argument you could give against morality, you could run a parallel argument against the existence of the elephant, meaning if you tried to reduce morality to merely a subjective phenomenon, an illusion, well, the same argument could be given against the validity. Somebody might bring up this socio-biological evolution of morality and say, oh, morality is just the product of socio-biological factors, culture and natural selection working on random mutation and so on. But guess what? We can say the same exact thing about the elephant. We can say, oh yeah, the only reason you see that elephant is because you evolved to see it. So the epistemology of it, of how we come to know of morality or how we come to see the elephant, even if it is through evolution, and I certainly have no brief to carry there, I think that might very well be true. But that does nothing to do, moral epistemology has nothing to do with moral ontology, of whether something exists as such, the being of, the suchness of morality, for example. So again, would anybody accept the argument that, oh, the only reason you think that elephant is there is because you were evolved to see that elephant? Well, obviously we were evolved to see the elephant. It seems like we were evolved to see the elephant. It seems like it anyways. I do subscribe to some theory of evolution in some degree. I'm not a neo-Darwinian by any measure, but all that aside, it's really irrelevant to the discussion. Is the elephant something that I evolved to discover, or is the elephant something that I evolved to invent? And again, I think most sane people would say, no, you're discovering the elephant. Like, it's actually there. That elephant is real, dude. Well, same thing with morality. Just explaining it in evolutionary or socio-biological account does nothing to answer the question of ontology, whether we're, again, discovering a moral law or whether we're inventing a moral law. So trying to explain away morality, and I'm offering arguments against objective morality right now, from an evolutionary standpoint, is just not a good argument. It's a confusion of morals, just moral ontology. Now, another one that people might give is, well, moral standards have changed from individuals and cultures, and there's been times when people just did really bad moral things. So obviously, absolute moral values don't exist. And here I would say, be very, very careful of your language, because when I say objective moral values, I don't mean absolute moral values, like this is always right, or people always think this is right, and this is always wrong, and people always think this is wrong. Objective moral values is only committed that there is a such thing as truly right and wrong in the world. Now, what is truly right and wrong may very well depend on the context. I am not a moral absolutist, for example. I don't think that lying is always wrong. If there's an innocent child in my house that somebody is out trying to hunt and kill, and they come to my front door, I think the right thing to do would be to lie and say, no, that kid is not in my house. Go away, strange person. But I still believe that I did something that was truly right. So we don't have to be a moral absolutist to affirm objective moral values. There's a difference. But we also don't have to subscribe to moral universalism, right? To say that universal moral values exist is different than objective moral values exist. So, for example, we could imagine a universal morality, say a classic sort of thought experiment here. Say Hitler won World War II, and say that he brainwashed everybody into thinking that, what he did was a good thing, or that like eugenics and stuff like that was a good thing. So he either brainwashed everyone into believing that and just killed off anybody who didn't. So everybody on the planet thinks that, everything Hitler did and continued to do was a good thing. That would be a universal morality. Everybody thinks they're doing the right thing, but that's not an objective morality, because I think we would all say, no, even though everybody thinks that's right, it's still wrong. So objective morality does not mean absolute morality. And it also doesn't mean that everybody agrees on it. Just because everybody agrees on a certain moral position doesn't mean that that is the right moral position. So you, again, as a moral realist, as somebody who affirms objective moral values, you don't have to assume that our moral sense is infallible. Obviously, our moral sense is fallible. And this is another argument people will pose. They will say, well, you know what, like certain cultures like engaged in slavery, and there's even people who like eat other people. They're cannibals. Like, doesn't that show that objective moral values do not exist? And the answer is no, because when you look at moral values, they actually do tend to be quite universal. What happens is people have a difference of opinion on the moral facts. So the cannibals still subscribe to the moral value of, care for your neighbor. There's just one slight hiccup. They don't typically view other tribes as, we would obviously say, no, like everybody, every human person is your neighbor. Like treat them all as your neighbor, right? You've got your facts wrong. But it doesn't mean that they don't have that sense of truly right and truly wrong. It doesn't mean that they don't share moral values that pretty much all societies and cultures have shared. And when you look at it, there are certain moral values like caring for your neighbor or modesty in certain circumstances that really that really can be found in all cultures and all times, but they're often expressed and interpreted in very different ways. And sometimes we would say in ways that are very wrong, like you're getting the facts wrong. This isn't enough. But again, that does nothing to show that objective moral values exist. I actually think it's an argument for objective moral values, that we see these values, however they tend to be interpreted or misinterpreted, as something just inherent to human beings. And so we've pretty much done away with all the main objections to moral realism, beings. And so we've pretty much done away with all the main objections to moral realism. That's really it. That's the best that the critic has. But there is one more thing that needs to be considered. And that is, okay, if objective moral values and duties do exist, moral value meaning we believe certain things are good, right, or evil. A moral duty implying that certain actions are right or wrong, that we have an obligation to do certain things, or we have a prohibition to not do other things. That's what we mean by values on one hand and duties. So we're trying to affirm a moral law, but then we realize, okay, if we're discovering a moral law, if this really does exist, which it seems like it does, it's so overwhelmingly obvious. We all live our lives according to this. Even if we disagree with each other of what is right and wrong, we all are arguing from positions that we think there is truly right and truly wrong things in the world. I mean, pretty much all political debate revolves around that very notion that we're all affirming moral realism, and we're saying, yeah, no, I'm right. No, you're right. Okay, that's a difference of moral facts and opinions, but you don't really hear too many people out there arguing like, well, unfortunately, you hear more people like this, as you've heard me share in my crazy experience with the professor from Planet Brain, who's a moral relativist, who thinks that there are no objective moral values, and you should therefore not critique or instruct or praise or blame anybody's moral behavior. Now, this is obviously insane for a number of reasons. As one, she has no good reason to reject objective moral values for reasons that I've just given, and more reasons I will continue to give. But she doesn't live her life that way. She actually actively advocates for many causes that she believes are right and just. So she's living in a constant before. On one hand, she says that there are no such thing as objective moral values, and you shouldn't try to change people's behavior or critique them or condemn them or blame them or praise them. But then on the other hand, 10 seconds later, she goes around and just acts completely in the opposite direction. So it's mind-boggling that somebody like this would actually be teaching at a university. But here we are. Wait till she gets a load of my speech. So, and please see the post I put on Facebook about this. Most people, obviously, sane people, were in enormous agreement with everything I said. But a few people felt the odd need to try and defend this person. It's just weird. Anyway, what the heck was I saying? Oh, yes, the ontological foundations for objective moral value. So, we're discovering the sense of truly right and wrong, that we do have certain obligations. I walk by a kid drowning or appearing to be drowning in a shallow pond, And I feel like I just need to rescue this kid. I'm obligated to rescue this kid. Of course not. I certainly hope not. If you did, we would say, if somebody strongly disagreed with that, what would we say about that person? We would say, there's something wrong with you, right? Of course you're obligated to save that kid. And anybody who disagrees, we think that that person is suffering some type of impairment or disability, like somebody who's blind. Their moral sense is defective. And I think people's moral sense can be defective. Obviously it can be, just like all the other senses can be defective. So we don't have to, and I think everybody's moral sense is defective to some extent, but some people's it would be severely impaired. So where do these values and duties come from? Well, in certain atheistic philosophy, people would say, if God does not exist, there are no objective moral values. And the most common form of atheism is naturalism, which just says, hey, nature is all there is. The universe just popped into being out of nothingness magically somehow, and, here we are. It's such a silly position. But if this is the case, and you are a naturalist and you think that nature is all there is, then evolution is the only game in town. That's all you have. So morality, if you're an atheist, would have to be an illusion. It would just have to be a helpful mechanism for the propagation of DNA. There's just no other place that you could ground objective moral values and duties. They are purely subjective, purely relative, and this is the position that you are forced in. Now, people will try and say, well, we can ground utility we can ground morality in humans. Yes, humanism, that's good, but that doesn't give us a reason why we should value humans. Why stop at humans? That just seems speciesist. It seems like you're just arbitrarily favoring your own species. Why not extend the same rights to fruit bats or dung beetles or dogs or monkeys? Fruit bats or dung beetles or dogs or monkeys. So humanism suffers from a sort of arbitrary stopping point. It doesn't have, again, there's no obligation or duty why you should do that. That's just your opinion, and an opinion isn't a good argument. Other people would say that you could base it in utility, whatever promotes the most amount of human happiness or flourishing, that's what's moral. And there's a million problems with a utilitarian view of morality. And I think it's a very dangerous view of morality, because we could imagine a certain scenario or world where what contributes to flourishing is morally wrong. For example, just imagine a world populated by psychopaths or rapists, and the thing that contributes to their flourishing is killing and raping. Would we say that that is then moral? Of course not. And this is just using a little bit of sort of modal logic or modal intuition, where we can see if we're trying as morality, if we're trying to say that these things are equal, all we have to think of is one example where these things are not equal to show that they're not actually equal. So if we can think of one example where whatever promotes a certain utility is not the moral thing, for example, promoting the happiness of people who are murderers or rapists or whatever, obviously we would say, no, that is wrong. That is not moral. Or, for example, there's a lot of good thought experiments against utilitarianism. Say that 5 people need an organ transplant and that they're suffering deeply. Would it then be wrong to go out and just grab one innocent person, maybe even a child, and kill them and take their organs? Well, the amount of happiness overall could possibly be increased. 5 people are now going to be happier, and only one person has to suffer the immense misery of getting their organs siphoned. So, yeah, utilitarianism just doesn't fly. It doesn't work. Unfortunately, certain philosophers have promoted this. Certain secular philosophers have promoted this, and this has become a very dangerous moral philosophy, and I think it's partly what has led to some of the greatest holocausts, to be literal, and genocides in human history, because we lost the necessary and proper ontological foundations of morality, which of course is God. If you want to have a moral law and obligations and duties and values, then it only makes sense if there is a moral law giver. Okay, and this is ultimately where morality gets you. This, by the way, C.S. Lewis presents this beautifully in Mere Christianity, which I'll constantly recommend, as he presents almost anything beautifully, and he presents it differently than I am. So the argument that I'm fundamentally presenting here, if we want to try and put it into a syllogism, would go something like this. Premise 1: If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. And again, many great atheistic philosophers would affirm this. Nietzsche famously said there are no objective moral facts. Flat out. He was at least consistent. And then, Richard Dawkins has said this, and Dawkins is funny because he'll say that it's just blind, pitiless indifference of the universe, and that morality is illusion. He'll say that in his book, but then he'll go on Twitter and constantly rail against certain people or political parties or whatever. So, classic performance contradiction again, right? He's acting as if some things are truly right and truly wrong, even though he'll say that they aren't. So, when your philosophy makes you that inconsistent in life, it's time to start tracing some of your steps along the way and see, where did I make a wrong turn? Or should I really just adjust my behavior and become a total nihilist? So, as the first premise, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Again, if you're an atheist, a naturalist, if evolution is the only game in town, we just have no place that can hold or support or be the foundation for some type of morality that is valid and binding, independent of human being. Morality is completely subjective. It is an illusion. It doesn't exist. So that's premise one. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise two is this. Objective moral values and duties do exist. And then it would follow logically and necessarily that God exists. And this is a great little apologetic toolkit. This is a great little argument. Because the funny thing is most atheists will kind of affirm premise one, but then they'll also want to affirm, oddly enough, premise two. Most people, as you know, want to believe that there is some, and you only need one example. You just need to get somebody to admit that just one thing in this world is truly wrong. So just bring up like the torture and killing of a small innocent child for fun. If so long as they just say that, yes, that one thing is truly wrong, then they are affirming objective moral values. And that's all. You only need one instance to support that argument. Now, if they deny it, everybody's going to think that they're insane and ridiculous, and they're just not being true to their experience and the way that reality is actually perceived. They tend to just be dogmatic. And then they would have to give some type of argument to say why objective moral values and duties do not exist. And I spent the largest part of this episode going through those arguments. They might try and explain it away through evolution, which we've seen that argument fails, because that doesn't say whether we're inventing, and explain it away through evolution, which we've seen that argument fails, because that doesn't say whether we're inventing or discovering anything. And if you're saying that we're inventing something, well, that just assumes that atheism is true. That just begs the question. So that isn't a valid argument. You would have to give us further reasons to think that atheism is true. I don't think there's any good reasons for that. Especially if you want to affirm objective moral values, that this argument affirms the existence of God. They might say that moral values and duties differ over time and culture, but we already went through that, the difference between objective moral values versus absolute moral values, and that there's no inherent contradiction between people having an infallible moral sense of interpreting certain contexts or moral facts differently. There's no contradiction between that and an objective moral values and duties existing. People get stuff wrong all the time. Just because people get math problems wrong, just because people would get 2 + 2 wrong, doesn't mean that 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4, for example. So I like this argument, and I will say that this was an argument that I initially didn't pay all that much attention to when I first started looking at a lot of the philosophical arguments for the existence of God. But this one I found is really special and powerful, because it hits people right where they live. People will be out there like, I don't believe in God, or I'm not religious. But you know what? Nobody wants to give up the idea, the belief, because it is so properly basic. Nobody wants to give up the belief that there are some things in this world that are truly right and truly wrong. So if they want to hold on to that belief, if they want to affirm that belief, and let's be honest, everybody does, then they're going to have to find some type of ontological foundation to support this. And ultimately that is going to have to be God. Now, if you're getting into a debate or argument, you can count on this argument coming up. It happens every time. They'll say, are you saying that because I don't believe in God, I can't be a good person? And you'll have to tell them very, very calmly, no, because they'll often be agitated by this. This is like 9 times out of 10, this is what they say when I first present this argument, and often in a very defensive mode. I say, no, that's absolutely not what I'm saying. I didn't say that you have to believe in God to be a good person. This has nothing to do with believing in God. What I'm saying is if you want objective morals and values to exist, if you want to affirm that there are things in this world, in this universe, that are truly right and truly wrong, then you need God to be the foundation of those objective moral values and beliefs. So in one way, yeah, you can't be good without God, because if God didn't exist, then good makes no sense. It becomes a meaningless term. It's like the color 7. It doesn't mean anything. It's an illusion. It doesn't exist. So if you want to affirm that, work your way through this argument. I'll state it one more time, and I'll put it in the show notes too. And there's a lot of people who've presented this argument really well over the years. And this is I would say a very simple presentation of it. There's more involved versions of moral arguments that I think are even more powerful, but they're a little more technical, a few more premises included. But this is a good one to just get started. And a lot of people kind of intuitively know this argument, but they will phrase it wrong. So you don't want to make this argument and say, if you're an atheist, you can't be a good person. That's obviously not the case. A number of my friends are atheists. They're incredibly good people overall. So again, it has nothing to do with moral epistemology or how you come to know your moral beliefs. These seem to be just ingrained within us. Of course, in the Bible it says that God wrote the moral law on our hearts, so this shouldn't be a surprise to any believing person that they are there. So you don't have to believe in God. You don't any believing person that they are there. So you don't have to believe in God. You only have to be a religious person to be a morally good person. But if you want to affirm that some things in this world actually are good and actually are evil, then you're going to have to, one way or another, affirm the existence of God, as troubling as that may be for people of deep unbelief. But that's why I like this argument, because it really shakes people up. Nobody wants to give up. Nobody wants to say, for example, that what Hitler did was just distasteful. That the most you could say about the Holocaust is you just didn't like it, right? But that's all you got. That's all you got on atheism or naturalism. You can't say that it was evil. You can't say that it was wrong, because there is no evil, right? To say that something is evil means that something else must be good. There must be some type of standard out there from which good and evil, thing is evil. You're saying that something must be good. Okay, where is the standard coming from? And you're saying it's not an illusion, so therefore, okay. And then you can see where I'm going with this. You see where it eventually works people. And if you just press it enough, if you just ask enough questions, they'll eventually either get very frustrated and walk away. They might stubbornly deny it and say, okay, it is all an illusion, but they don't really believe that. They just don't want to concede the argument. So I like this, and I hope this has been helpful. And like I said, I will try to... And what does this tell us about God? Well, it tells us actually... it tells us about God's character. It tells us that there is an objective source of goodness in the world, and an authority, a moral authority from which we derive our obligations and duties. Because of course, obligation makes no sense unless there's an authority out there. People might say, okay, well, God isn't. And this is another classic one you might hear, the Euthyphro dilemma. People will say, okay, well, God doesn't make sense as a foundation for morality, because is something good because God wills it, or does God will something because it's good? And neither of these answers seem totally right, because if God wills something because it's good, it makes it seem like there's something higher than God, which that doesn't make sense. God, if anything, is the highest conceivable being, a maximally great being. So that doesn't seem right. Or is something good because God wills it, make it seem like things like love and caring for your neighbor and whatever are just arbitrarily good, that they could have been different. And that doesn't seem right either, because we can't really imagine any world where like torture would be good. But this is really, the Euthyphro dilemma is what would be called a false dilemma. A true dilemma in philosophy with logic would be the option A or not A. Like, for example, either God exists or he does not exist. You have to go with one. But the Euthyphro dilemma is not really a dilemma at all. Its options are A or B. So you get around this by actually going between the horns, by positing a third option. And the answer, and the right answer to the Euthyphro dilemma, is that God himself is the standard of goodness. His nature is essentially all good, all loving, all just, all compassionate, and so on and so forth. So objective moral values are grounded in God's nature, and objective moral duties and obligations are grounded in God's will. So very easy to get over. It's amazing how many people will still bring out the Euthyphro dilemma. It's like this has been answered for thousands of years, but you'll still hear it all the time. It just goes to show how many people who are anti-religious, even philosophers who really should know better, just don't read the counter arguments. And I don't want to say all. Of course, I don't want to make any hasty generalizations, but I will say, in my experience, this is so common, and I do a lot of debating with people, and the two things that people who are philosophers, which will surprise me when I bring this argument up, is they'll say, "Are you saying I can't be good because I don't believe in God?" Which is just irrelevant to the argument, or they'll roll out that that old chestnut, the Euthyphro dilemma. So again, just be ready for those if you're like me and you enjoy getting into it with people and debate. And always be civil, always be courteous. It's always important to remember that we're trying to share faith. It's not about winning an argument, right? It's about winning a soul. So, sometimes you have to realize, okay, it's not just about being right? We do a lot of listening, be charitable, be confident. You're right. You got the right position. We've talked about be confident. You're right. You got the right position. We've talked about this before. You are in the right. You might not understand all the reasons why, but you're right. You're definitely right. So this has been my brief impromptu presentation of the moral argument. Not the tightest format. I kind of rambled around with it, but I think we got it all in there. When I present it in this class, it'll be in the syllogism, and I'll go point by point. It will be a little bit more structured. So like I said, I'm going to see if I can have that filmed or at least recorded on audio, and I'll find out a way to post it or put it in. But hey, if you're enjoying Sunday school, and I've been getting so many wonderful emails from people. It's just, this has affirmed again the reason why I started this. So the reason why I started this is I talked about, I kind of talked about faith a little bit in certain podcasts, and I never really hid it or suppressed it, but I never made it the primary talking point. And then so many people came forward and said, this is so important and not enough people are talking about it, at least not in like, you'll hear about it in like, specifically if you go look at religious podcasts and things like that, but not enough people in general are talking about it. And it's so important, especially in the health and fitness industry. So thank you for that. Thank you for reaching out and encouraging me to continue this dialogue and to continue these conversations. I really do hope they are helpful for you, both in deepening your faith, deepening your commitment to with your relationship to God, and also helping you to share your faith and defend your faith as well. So I would simply say, if you do find this helpful, if you do find it interesting, the best way that you could help me in return and support what I'm doing here is just subscribe to iTunes and leave a review. That would mean the world to me, and that's really all we need to keep pushing this message forward. And we do want to push this message forward because it's the great news, right? Like God. So thanks for the support, folks. We'll talk to you soon.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.